reproduction seems to confer some substantial benefit in the process. So this is something I've been interested in the last year or so. Every time I talk about it, I joint work with Antonio Montalban. Yeah, so this certainly sounds like a very biological question. Right? So you might immediately wonder, why should computer scientists be interested in this? Why should we think that computer scientists could be able to say anything about this? The basic answer there is, in a basic sense, the task of optimizing the fitness of an individual organism. This is an optimization task, right, like any other. So we have another system of standards for. So we have a sort of input parameters to be played with. So here the input parameters might be the genes. So which genes are going to make up the genome of the organism in question. And for each set of input parameters, we have a score. Right? So in this case, the score is the fitness. So this gives us some sort of resulting fitness landscape. And the task of optimizing the fitness of the individual amounts to finding like, the high points in this fitness landscape. So this is a familiar picture of maths and computer science. Right? For example, if we're training a neural net, and you have a set of weights to be playing with for each set of values for those weights, you have a certain level of performance for the system, and training the net corresponds to finding a set of weights that gives the level. So it's a very familiar picture, but in computer science, genetic algorithms, while they might have had some limited success in certain areas, generally speaking, perhaps they haven't been quite as successful as one might have hoped. In nature, though, it seems like sexual reproduction is the go-to method, at least for higher organisms. So we want to understand why that's the case, whether there's anything we can learn from that. Okay, so I think it's interesting when I speak to people about this, it seems like often you have to persuade people that there's a problem to be solved before you can start addressing this to solve that problem. So people give different kinds of reactions, but a common reaction is as follows. Isn't it kind of obvious that sexual reproduction produces greater variety? Greater variety is a good thing. So I guess the kind of picture people have in mind, you have a father, you have a mother, they produce some offspring, there's maybe somewhere between the father and mother. And that offspring is maybe more different than the mother, say, than an asexually reproduced offspring. When you look more closely, though, you realise that in fact it isn't at all obvious. Okay, so first of all, Asex actually outperforms sex in many models, in many simulations. So certainly just saying sex produces greater variety, that's a good thing. That isn't going to cut it. And it isn't actually at all clear that sex does produce greater variety. In fact, when Darwin and Wallace and people were first coming out with these ideas, it was a problem they had to describe how a sexually reproducing population could maintain any variety at all. So they were coming out with these ideas slightly before people were aware of Mendelian segregation. So the sort of picture you might have in mind is of mixing paint. Right? So if you have some blue paint and some yellow paint, and you mix them together, and you get some green paint. So far so good, that seems quite different than yellow and green paint, some yellow and blue paint. But if we keep on mixing all the paint together, eventually what we end up with is just some uniformly brown paint. Okay, so how can a sexually reproducing population maintain variety? So to some extent, okay, that's answered by Mendelian segregation, but even then, it's not at all clear that a sexually reproducing population will produce greater variety. And even if it does, then you have to prove that that's necessarily a good thing. And not only do you have to prove that that's a good thing, you also have to show that it outweighs substantial costs involved in the sexual reproduction. So there are many of those. I'm just going to go through with some couple of the principal ones. So first of all, it shouldn't be surprising that sex at least threatens to break down favourable gene combinations built up by past selection. Okay, so the sort of picture we have in mind here is you've got the father's DNA, you've got the mother's DNA. In the form of the offspring, you take some of the father's DNA, some of the mother's DNA, and splice those two things together. So the analogy I'm going to use here is stolen from Sarah Otto. So you imagine a large game of poker, you've got 1,000 players in this round of poker. The idea of having 1,000 players is probably isn't very good to bluff here. It's probably not much point bluffing, because people have in hands. If we whittle the players down, so we've only got sort of 3 players left, very good hands. And if you go to two of those players and you say, would you like to shuffle your cards together to form a new hand? And of course they're going to say no. You take two very good poker hands, like these two here, these two very strong poker hands, where I take one card from the first player, one card from the second player, and so on. Then very probably what I end up with is not very good poker hand. So yeah, so sex at least threatens to break down favourable gene combinations. Another basic cost, which is often called the twofold cost of sex, so it's basically as follows. So if we have, let's say, an asexually reproducing population, or a population in which people or individuals sometimes reproduce sexually, sometimes asexually, if a mother goes to produce some offspring in an environment which is going to support a fixed number of offspring, then presumably it's of some advantage to her not to mix her DNA with that of a male. She wants to pass on as much of her DNA as possible. Okay, so those are sort of two basic costs, and many more costs you consider. So it seems like if there are these substantial costs involved, then there must be some substantial advantage in sexual reproduction processes. Okay, so now let's take a look at the basic form of the model. So for us, the genome is simply going to be a sequence of genes. Okay, a sequence of L-many genes. L will be fixed for human population. And okay, so each individual is essentially going to be a sequence of genes. We don't really care what those genes are. We don't care anything about the internal structure of the genes. Each individual is simply a sequence of genes, L-many genes. Okay. A little bit of biological terminology. So here we have a number of different positions where genes can be. So in the first position we have the first gene, second position, the second gene, and so on. And each position we call a locus. Okay, so each locus has a particular gene. And a plural locus is on the side. So if we fix a locus, then in the population as a whole, there may be a number of different forms of the gene occurring at that locus. Okay, so some individuals might have the gene coding for brown eyes, some for blue eyes, and so on. So there's different forms of the gene called our locus. So in reality, most sexually reproducing organisms are actually diploid, which means that genes occur in pairs. I don't want to worry about that. So we'll keep things simple for now. Everything I'm going to say can be made to work for diploid organisms as well. But for now, we'll keep things simple. Each individual is simply a sequence of genes. And then each individual has a fitness, okay, some number, f of x, and f of x is simply going to be the expected number of offspring for that individual, okay, proportional to it. So if one individual has twice the fitness, then he has twice the expected number. Okay, so now we have to decide how the fitness of the individual is going to be determined by the fitness of the genes. Okay, and one particularly simple way that we do that is as follows. So for each gene we assign some fitness. Okay, this is just a number. So xi is the ith gene. And that will have some fitness, f of xi. And then we could just say that the fitness of the individual is just the sum of the fitnesses of the individual genes. One particularly simple way to proceed. If we do that, I call that the additive model. We can proceed multiplicatively. Okay, that's another model. Call that the multiplicative model. Okay, but mainly I'm going to be interested in the additive model. So this is a big simplification, because in reality, you will have pairs of genes and gene sequences which combine to be more than the sum of the parts, right? So often you'll have one gene on its own might not be achieving anything amazing, this other gene on its own might not be achieving anything amazing, but the two together combine to do something special. So what we really should have, so when that happens, this is what biologists call epistasis, we should really have an error term on the right hand side here, so epistasis term that takes account of the special ways in which genes combine. Okay, arguments about how large those epistasis terms should be. But for now, I'm going to keep things very simple. I'm going to imagine zero epistasis. Okay, so we work with a simple case first before we move on to the more complicated case. Delta. Okay, so each individual is simply a sequence of genes, and his fitness is given by the sum of the individual gene fitnesses. Given that we don't really care what those genes are, you can really think of the genes as just being a number. Right? So each individual essentially becomes a vector, describing the fitnesses of each of those individual genes. Okay, so now we're going to define a simple dynamical system, or two, one for sex, one for asex. Okay, and amount and showing that sex outperforms Asex, will basically amount to understanding how those dynamical systems progress. So I'm going to consider non-overlapping generations. Okay, so that means we're going to have a first generation, and that will then produce a second generation. The first generation disappears. The second generation produces a third generation. The second generation disappears. So for some species, this might seem like it's a reasonable approximation. You have seasonal crops, for example. For other species, you might think, well, that's not a good approximation because as humans are dying all the time, being born all the time, and so on. But in fact, there are theories that show that if you consider populations with overlapping generations, then after a certain amount of time, when things are settled down a bit, they behave basically like populations with non-overlapping generations, at least in the sense that they're important to us. Okay, so this is in fact a standard reasonable approximation. Okay, so let's first of all describe the process for Asex. So I'm going to consider finite and infinite population models. Basically, the finite population models are really the ones that we get sort of mostly interested in, but the infinite population models are the ones where you can actually prove things like that. Okay, so we'll start off by describing the finite population models. So for Asex, things work as follows. So we have to decide how we're going to allow the population size to change from one generation to the next. What I'm going to do is I'm going to leave population size fixed. Okay, suppose we have p many individuals in the first generation, we're going to have p many individuals in the second generation, and so on. You could vary the population size in each generation. It wouldn't really change things, essentially, as far as I can say. Okay, so we start off with p many individuals in the first generation. We have to decide how then we're going to produce the second generation. So there are two basic operations: there's selection and mutation in the Asex process. So selection works as follows: so each individual produces a number of offspring, and the expected number of offspring is proportional to their fitness. So you can think of that simply as being sampling with replacement. Right? Each time you sample, the probability I choose to copy an individual X is proportional to their fitness. So that's selection, but then we also have mutation. So as we copy each individual, how do we do that? Well, we take the individual, we go to each gene in turn, and we copy that gene across to form the gene for the new individual. Okay? But each time we make a copy, there's some chance that we make a mistake. Right? So there's some chance that we change the thickness of the gene in question. Okay. So we're just thinking of these genes really as being numbers. What we would care about is their thickness. So as I copy an individual, and as I go to copy each gene, there's some chance I change the thickness of that gene. So initially now, it seems like there's a bit of a problem. So how should we define this mutation distribution? But it turns out it doesn't really matter that much, because as long as this mutation acts independently from one stage to another, basically by adding up independent distributions, then anyway they're going to approximate Gaussian in some form for multiple generations. So all that really matters is the following. So we're going to assume that mutation is non-trivial, so there's some chance of changing the thickness of each gene. I'm going to assume that the most likely outcome is that you don't change the thickness of the gene, so we're copying reasonably accurately, that's realistic. And I'm also going to assume that negative mutations are more likely than positive ones. And again, that's realistic. Shouldn't be that surprising. Right? You write a computer program and someone comes along and changes an arbitrary bit of the program, you don't expect it to improve the program.
Not if you have a finite length of DNA.
Say again?
Not if the DNA length is finite.
Not if it's finite.
Yeah. In finite DNA length, it's not the case.
It's not the case that negative mutations are more likely.
Yeah, because you can be diametrically opposite the optimum, then the optimal mutation rate, any mutation is supposed to be negative.
Okay, I'm informed by biologists they expect most mutations to be negative mutations.
Because they work in Fisher's model, which is simply repeating space, not having space.
Okay, well. But biologists believe that negative mutations are more likely. That's not at all surprising to me. If you had positive mutations being more likely, then I guess a lot of what I say about the same still be true, but it becomes trivial because everyone's going to go after the top possible thickness and just sit there. So sex and Asex will essentially become the same, and everything will just evolve to maximum possible thickness, and it's a trivial system. Okay, so where was I? So, right, so we're assuming that mutation is non-trivial, there's some non-trivial chance of mutation, and I'm going to assume that it's most likely when you copy a gene that you're not going to change the thickness of a gene, and if you do change the thickness, then it's more likely that you change it in a negative way. So that's Asex. And sex proceeds basically in the same fashion initially, but we have an extra phase. Okay, so each individual starts by producing an expected number of offspring which is proportional to their fitness. Again, as we copy each individual, we copy each gene one at a time, and there's some chance of making an error and copying the gene, and there's some chance that we change the fitness of the gene. Now, though, there's an extra phase, so this now is not what we produced so far, is not the end result, that's not the next generation. This is the gametes, these are the sperm of the eggs. So now in order to form the next generation, we go through a proper process of recombination, so we pick pairs of individuals, so uniformly random, and we combine each pair to form a new individual by taking some genes from this, some genes from the father and some genes from the mother. Okay, so a particularly simple way we can do this is to go to each locus one at a time, take either the gene from the mother or the gene from the father with 50-50 probability. That wouldn't be entirely realistic. It would be realistic if there are the genes occurring on separate chromosomes. So those are the finite population models. And you can also consider infinite population version of those. It's kind of obvious how that would work. It's essentially the same thing, except now everything's deterministic. Okay? So now population is a probability distribution on genotypes. Another important distinction, so we can consider bounded models, in which there is a maximum possible attainable fitness for any given gene. And we can also consider unbounded models. Okay, so in bounded models, there's some bound on the fitness that any given gene can achieve. Okay, we're going to be interested in both of those. Okay, so I'm not going to try and give literature review because there's not enough time, but just to give sort of some impression of some of the principal ideas out there as to why recombination might be useful. So recombination, why is the difference between the sex and the Asex processes is one. So one of the principal ideas, which goes right back to the 1930s, is that recombination can be useful in placing beneficial mutations which initially occur in distinct individuals together onto the same chromosome. Okay, so let's see how this works. Let's imagine we have a finite population. Let's imagine, for the sake of simplicity, that everybody starts off by being identical. Okay, so each dot here is just some individual. Let's say they're all identical to start with. Right, so we'll consider the Asex process first, let's say. So in a given generation, you might see two different beneficial mutations occur. Okay? So distinct individuals at different places in the genome. So here we have a red mutation and we have a blue mutation. Okay? So in reality, as I say, most mutations would actually be deleterious, be bad mutations, but let's suppose for a second that that isn't the case, and that all we really have to care about is the beneficial mutations. That's the thing that's going to drive how this population. Okay, so we have a red mutation of a blue mutation. Let's suppose that the red mutation increases the fitness of the individual in question by more than the blue mutation. So now we expect these two mutations, because they increase the fitnesses of the individuals in question, to start spreading throughout the population, but they're competing, right? So ultimately, we expect the red mutation to be the one that achieves fixation and spreads throughout the entire population. So what you've seen is that there are two beneficial mutations occur, and of course we can only take advantage of one of them in the asexual process. So what happens in the sex process? Well, you can imagine, so here in any given generation we might have two beneficial mutations. Okay? And now again these will start spreading, but now what can happen is that we can form, via recombination, we can form an individual which has both of those beneficial mutations. We have a mother with one of the beneficial mutations and a father with the other. And by recombination, those two beneficial mutations can be placed onto the same gene. So now we get some purple individuals. They're individuals that have both of those beneficial mutations. If each of those mutations individually is beneficial, then we would think that two of them combined would be even better. That's not necessarily the case. Genes could combine together in complicated ways, but certainly according to our simplified model, where the individual fitness is simply the sum of the individual gene fitnesses, certainly here it's going to be true. So then we expect the individuals with both beneficial mutations to spread So in this case, we take advantage of both beneficial mutations. Okay, so as one mechanism you can consider, there are many other mechanisms. There are difficulties in analysis. First of all, the maths quickly becomes complicated, so people end up looking at a small microcosm situation where you have 2 or 3 different loci and 2 different alleles each. More important than that, though, it's generally found to require rather specific conditions in order for this to be a substantial effect. And more important than that, it's not clear how you show that this benefit, any benefit conferred by this mechanism, how would you show that this outweighs its substantial costs and problems. Okay? And that's a familiar sort of picture. So there are lots of different mechanisms you consider, but every time the problem is the same. You may or may not be able to establish that this is a mechanism which confers advantage to the sexual process. But there's basically no framework for showing that the benefits conferred outweigh the substantial costs. So you don't really end up understanding how it is that the sex outperform anything. So we're undertaking, so what is it we do differently? So we've got a different form of mathematical analysis. So what we don't do is to concentrate on particular mechanisms. Basically, we track the population as a whole as it moves across vast fitness landscapes. So the form of the analysis means that we no longer have to consider small microcosms of the situation. We consider very large fitness landscapes. And immediately in that context, even just in simulations, before we get to the theorems, you see sex much more robustly outperforming Asex. So here we have some simulations. So the top 4 there, these are for the additive model, the finite population model. This one's for the infinite population model, and these for the multiplicative model on the right side. In each graph, so this is the mean fitness of the population model every time, and the bottom graph is the variance of the fitness of the population. Okay, so you can see that in every case, except in the multiplicative infinite model, where sex and asex remain identical, in every case, every other case, sex very robustly outperforms asex. This is a small cross-section experiment, so this is seen much more generally. Okay, so now let's see a animation simulation. So yeah, so generally we're working with a fairly large number of those. So I might have each individual. So reality, of course, have thousands of genes. But if I'm going to show pictures of things, then I normally have to work with 2 locus populations, individuals who make up 2 genes to actually see what's going on. So here, this is going to be a simulation for a 2 locus population. This is a finite population model. And on this axis here, we have fitness on the first gene, so increase in this direction. This axis here is fitness on the second gene. So overall fitness is increasing on the line x equals y. So we're going to have a sexual population, an asexual population. The sexual population will be red, and the asexual population will be blue. I'll stop that going down. So when they're on top of each other, they appear sort of purpley. Okay? So initially you see there were purple mats. If we let that progress for some time, then you should gradually see right, so you gradually see the sexual population moving ahead in fitness, like the red guys. So the asexual population falling behind. And I also want to note the different shape of the 2 populations. The sexual population remains very rounded, while the asexual population becomes kind of flattened. Okay, so that's the important next one. Okay, so now what can we actually prove? So as I say, if we look at the okay, we're interested mainly, of course, in the finite population models, but all the proofs will be for the infinite population models, which are a reasonable approximation of some of the populations are sufficiently large. So for the bounded model, first of all, so the bounded model is where we have a maximum possible fitness that genes can achieve. So here what happens is, as long as the bound is sufficiently large, if we let sexual and asexual populations compete, then it will always be the sexual population which wins out. Okay? The asexual population will eventually extinguish. Right, so I'm not going to go through a massive amount of the details of the proof. What I want to do for most of the rest of the talk is to go through some basic principles involved. So this is for bounded populations, but everything else I'm going to say will actually hold for unbounded populations. Okay, so we've got to understand how these dynamical systems progress, how they evolve. And the mutation, selection, and recombination, how do they affect the population? Right, so I'm thinking of each of these things now as being an operation we apply to a population. So let's deal with mutation first of all. So this is the simplest one. So what will mutation do? Well, basically mutation just decreases the mean by a fixed amount at each stage. It decreases the mean because I'm assuming that negative mutations are more likely than positive. Okay, so mutation will decrease the mean by a fixed amount at each stage. And that amount will not depend on anything, won't depend on the population, won't depend on the stage. Simply depends on the mutation distribution used. So a mutation will cause a decrease, a fixed decrease in the mean at every single stage, independent of whether it was in the sexual population, the asexual population, exactly the same for both. And it will give a fixed increase in the variance. Can't quite see what's left. Okay, so that doesn't distinguish between the two processes at all. It's entirely reliable, that's completely stage. What does selection do? So that's a lot more complicated. But let's first of all just concentrate on what selection does to the mean fitness. So selection increases the mean fitness by an amount in stage, which is V over N. V is the variance in the fitness of the population. Okay, so immediately now you can see that the variance is going to be crucial here. The amount that selection increases the mean fitness by is V over N. You have two populations with the same mean, one has double the variance, and that one's going to see double the increase in mean fitness. It also will tend to decrease the variance, but let's not worry about that for now. What does recombination do? Well, first of all, think in terms of the mean fitness. In a direct way, it does nothing. If I take a population, I apply recombination, and afterwards it will have the same mean fitness that it did before. Okay, so now we can immediately see that if sex is going to outperform Asex, it's going to have to be because recombination increases variance. Okay, but the mutation just having a fixed effect each stage, same for both processes. The amount selection increases the mean fitness by is just variance. Recombination has no direct effect on the mean fitness. So if the sex process is going to see a faster increase in mean fitness, it's going to have to be because it's increasing the variance. So does it increase the variance? Well, so first of all, we can write down an expression for the effect of recombination on the variance. Don't want you to worry too much about what this really is. Okay, just you can write down some expression, which I'm calling LB2. Okay. So here xi is a random variable taking distributed according to the fitnesses at the ith locals. So anyway, we can write down some expression, which we're calling LB2, and the effect of recombination on the variance is minus LB2. So basically, what I want you to remember is that if we want to show that sex outperforms Asex, and a basic part of this will be showing that this LB2 term here, the English disequilibrium term, this tends to be negative. Okay, so can we show that? Well, yeah, we can. So in fact, what we can show is that if you take any population, you apply the operations of mutation and selection over and over in any order whatsoever, then any application of recombination will cause an increase in variance. So we take an asexually reproducing population, and at some stage we decide to apply recombination, and that will immediately cause an increase in variance, which will then, by selection, cause an increase in mean fitness. So here I have a simulation that shows exactly that happening. So it's the same sort of picture as before, but now it's with infinite populations. So here we have fitness for the first gene, fitness for the second gene, the y-axis. So overall fitness is increasing on the line x equals y. Okay, so we'll let the two populations progress now. So first of all we have the red guys, the sexual population, the blue guys are initially asexual, so you can see them falling behind fitness. At some point soon recombination will be applied. You'll see when, there you are. Can you see that? Can you see the blue? Yeah. Okay. So when recombination is applied, suddenly the asexual population saw a massive increase in variance, and that caused a massive, quick increase in influence. So this is for the bounded model, so that we're eventually reaching some sort of fixed point. Okay, so this is a sort of 3D representation of the same process. Here again, the x and y axis is the same, and the z axis is the probability density. Okay, so here we have the round guys, the sexual population is progressing to the first one. The sexual guy remains sexual to about 4 stages. For the first 2,000 stages here we have the asexual population, the guy who's falling behind. And again, you can see the different shape of the two populations. The sexual population has this rounded form, and the asexual population has a very much flattened form. At this stage here, we suddenly apply recombination. Suddenly, the asexual population takes on the rounded form, sees a great increase in the fitness variance, and a subsequent increase in mean fitness. So here, he basically catches up with the sexual population. We don't carry on applying recombination, eventually people fall behind. Okay, so recombination does increase variance when applied. So this LD term, what I wrote up before LD2, is a negative term. So roughly speaking, let me explain why that is. So the basic some pictures as follows. So again, we really want to work with a large number of loci, because each individual has L loci, when L be large, it's much clearer if we think in terms of two locus population. Okay, so here we have a two locus population again, X and Y axis, the fitness in the first and second genes. I guess darker red means higher probability density. So one thing I can do here is I can project the population to the line X equals Y. Okay, and if I do that, then the variance in the length of the resulting projection, that's basically the variance in the fitness of the population. Again, I can do a similar thing in L dimensions as well. So that's one thing I can do. I can also take the projection to the L-1 dimensional orthogonal complement. So in 2 dimensions, it's basically the projection to the line where X plus Y is constant. If I take the variance in the length of the resulting projection, that projection, then I'm going to call that the flat variance. Okay, so we have, so basically along the line X equals Y, the variance is like how tall the population is, and the flat variance is how fat the population is. And then what you can show is that this LD2 term here, which might be needed to be negative, this is basically this is the difference between the variance and the flat variance. So a population having a negative LD2, which means that the recombination will cause an increase in variance. This basically corresponds to the population being fatter than it is tall. And that's exactly what we saw in these simulations. Right? So here, if you look at the asexual population on the top row, the one that's falling behind, has a large flat variance and a small variance. Okay, so this figure shows what's happening a little bit more clearly, maybe in a step-by-step process. So again, the red guys are the sexual population, the blue guys are the asex, so they start off identical. When we apply selection, what it does is it tends to leave the flat variance unchanged. So it's leaving the population basically as fat as it was before, but it decreases the variance. Okay, so this is causing the flat variance to be greater than the variance, you have a negative LD2, which is what we want. We then apply mutation. This basically leaves things unchanged, except that it increases the variance, and the flat variance by the same amount. Okay, so it's not changing this LD2 term. Now, when we apply recombination, what happens is that this evens out the variance and the flat variance. Okay, so if you have greater flat variance than variance, then that's going to cause an increase in variance. Okay, and then finally, when selection acts, because the sexual population has a greater variance, we see a greater increase in variance. Okay, so I'll just finish off by showing you the results of some simulations. So again, these are for two locus populations, so you can see what's going on. Again, these are for the infinite population model and for the bounded model. So there's some bound in the maximum possible fitness that genes can have. So each point here is the centre of mass of some population. And these points here represent different